Hello, my name is Molly Ness. I am a teacher, educator, an author, and an associate professor of childhood literacy. In 2019, I began a podcast titled End Book Deserts to bring attention to the issue of book access and equity. Let's start off by clearing up the definition of a book desert. A book desert is an under-resourced or underserved area or home with little access to written materials. The term was coined by Unite for Literacy in 2010 and popularized in 2016 by Susan Newman and Naomi Moland, who used it in an article in Urban Education, and that definition is now a part of the ILA's literacy glossary. Before we begin tonight's conversation, I wanted to extend my most sincere gratitude to the International Literacy Association for their time and effort in planning this event. I also want to thank tonight's guests for their willingness to share their wisdom and their expertise and their experience. It's a real honor to have them join me and the ILA community to talk about such an important topic at such an important time. If you're participating in our conversation through Zoom, please submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will make sure to leave some time for some of these questions that are being submitted now and have previously been submitted. The event is being streamed through Facebook Live as well. The recording will be archived on Facebook and Zoom and on demand within a day or two, and YouTube within the week. The last bit of housekeeping before we get started, the hashtag we'll be using for tonight's conversation on social media is hashtag #EndBookDeserts. Over the past year, I've connected with researchers and literacy advocates like the ones you'll hear from tonight, who are passionate about ensuring that all children have access to age-appropriate, high-quality reading materials. They share a mission to get the right book into the hands of each reader and to promote a lifelong love of reading for all children, regardless of their zip code. Pre-pandemic, 32 million children lacked access to books in their homes, schools, and communities. This has always been an important issue and important work, but our pandemic today has made these inequities even more glaring. In 2018, the ILA launched the Children's Right to Read initiative. The first declaration is that children have the basic human right to read. The second is that children have the right to access texts in both digital and print formats. So in essence, book deserts negate a child's right to read. And that's what brings us here tonight. Our goal to guarantee that these rights are ensured for every child, everywhere. And I'm now pleased to introduce our panel. Let's first start with Susan Newman, who literally wrote the research on book deserts. She is a professor of teaching and learning at the New York University, specializing in childhood education and early literacy development. She served as the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education, and she is the author of over 100 articles and has authored and edited over 11 books. Welcome, Susan. Alistair Chang is known for finding new ways to connect books with people in resource-limited communities. He he's a visiting researcher at UNESCO's Institute for Lifelong Learning, and he's the founder of Civic Suds, which is a program that facilitates digital literacy training inside coin laundromats. He's also one of the ILA 30 Under 30 honorees in 2019. Thank you for joining us tonight, Alistair. And finally, I am pleased to introduce Carlos Marshall, who is another one of the ILA 30 Under 30 honorees. Carlos co-founded the Conscious Connect, a nonprofit with the goal of ending urban book deserts by creating access in everyday places, books access in barbershops, in beauty salons, and in community parks. Thank you for your time tonight, Carlos. So let me send the first question to Susan, who again has done so much of the pivotal research around book deserts. Susan, can you help our audience understand the research around book access? What do some of your findings show about the availability of books?
Well, the availability of books for so many of our children is abysmal. It is really a crisis situation that could so easily be ameliorated. And that's part of the frustration. So the way I define book deserts are places that have limited access to print for children and their families. And one of the things that we know is that in recent years, even before the pandemic, what we've seen is increasing income segregation. And what that means is that many of our communities are concentrated in poverty in a way that we haven't had before. So these people lack access where even transportation or ability to go to the library or some of the traditional access routes. And as a result, they have very little experience with print in the very early years. One of the things, just to give you an example, we did a study in the urban education article where we talked about Anacostia, which is a lovely neighborhood right near the capital of the United States. 27,000 people reside there. And over the summer, all we could find was 12 Spanish and English dictionaries. 830 children would have to share one book, and that book was a dictionary, not exactly your exciting reading. So real briefly, and then I'll turn it back to you, one of the things I would love to talk about today is what are the ramifications of that? What do we know about literacy and how it begins and what that lack of access actually means? If you lack access, you may not care about books, and that has tremendous implications for our educators.
And again, I just want to reiterate that your research is pre-pandemic. So certainly today, as schools and as libraries are shuttered, we are facing challenge upon a pre-existing challenge. Alistair, I wanted to turn the question to you. I know so much of your work is in the international sphere, so I'm hoping that you can relate some of that research that Dr. Newman was talking about with regard to the US. What are you seeing in the global sphere?
Mm-hmm. So internationally, I think that the pandemic has been raising questions of what resources for everybody are considered to be essential or non-essential, and which services are worthwhile to take on and at what level of risk. I think that these answers have to be answered, and they have been answered and should continue to be answered context by context. And so, you know, around the world, a lot of public library systems have closed, right? Including in Colombia, Malaysia, the Netherlands, Turkey. And many of these and other systems have reassigned budgets to pay for more electronic ebooks and programming around electronic resources. The Library of Alexandria, for example, is offering online book clubs. In Portugal, the libraries have a dedicated YouTube channel for virtual book readings. Some libraries in the US are beginning to offer Zoom subscriptions for their members. And, you know, I think those kinds of pivots are interesting in terms of meeting the current needs of their communities. I'll give one example from a Libraries Without Borders program in Bangladesh. My colleagues have been working in Cox's Bazar in partnership with the International Office of Migration. And we began our work there in 2016, expanding book access for Rohingya refugees. And when we started, our local partners told us that we would never see a girl or a woman in our information spaces because so many men are not comfortable with women having the skills that they themselves don't have. And at this point now, during the pandemic, we actually have half of the users in the library are women. And, I think a lot of women are feeling both engaged and authorized to utilize the books in our libraries there because of how we've reframed the importance of literacy learning as a means to fulfill tasks that are actually perceived to be in the women's domain. So, a lot of our local partners have told us that some of the families there consider administrative paperwork to be household tasks and therefore within the realm of women's responsibilities. And so by framing the book resources, the literacy learning around and reading and writing around a means to fill out health information, to collect it, to distribute it, right, as part of COVID-19 responses has actually enabled us to do more with women using these books. And I share this example because I want to stress the point that the pandemic may have changed a lot regarding how books are accessed, but I don't think it's changed the importance of framing books and book access as a means to achieve contextually specific goals, right? Particularly for people who live without a safety net, access to curated and relevant books can really solve immediate problems.
Thank you. Well, let me turn to Carlos. Carlos, you and I have had the pleasure of speaking on my podcast. We've written together. I was really hoping to be able to actually meet you face to face at ILA this upcoming fall. But for now, we'll have to continue our conversation digitally. I'm hoping you can talk about the work of Conscious Connect, how it's become even more pressing, and how you've been flexible and adaptive to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Molly. And you're certainly on point that our work as a grassroots literacy movement has become more critical now more than ever. You know, really the genesis of our organization is being cautiously creative and adaptive to the needs of our community. This means embracing prototyping, right? Everything that we've known in the world prior to COVID has completely shifted, and which has in some ways played to our advantage in terms of being able to more quickly adapt than some other organizations here within the literacy sphere, as well as just here locally in terms of what we're seeing and people being able to adjust on the fly, and also just being able to harness the entrepreneurial gene of failing fast and failing forward. We focus so much as so many people do here on this call, as well as my colleagues on the panel, on book deserts, and rightfully so. But I think as Susan points out, focusing on the lack of access, right? So what we understand is that book deserts don't exist in a vacuum. So the neighborhoods that we're working in, particularly in an urban context, we understand that these neighborhoods that are book deserts are also commonly and intentionally and systematically also food deserts, which we see as being an issue with the closure of schools. There are also employment deserts, which families and individuals of lower social economic status are adversely impacted by that as well. Banking deserts, digital deserts, and so on and so forth. So in our efforts to disrupt the status quo, the Conscious Connect was founded to address opportunity deserts and access gaps, not just the result of them, i.e. achievement gaps that we also talk about at length. So this was an intentional shift to really shift the paradigm and to reframe the narrative around the success and the opportunities of our students and of our children being at promise, as well as the underlying systematic issues that continue to perpetuate inequities. So our programs in barbershops and beauty salons, libraries, our mobile book bike, as well as our neighborhood reading parks and pocket parks were never meant to replace traditional institutions such as libraries and schools, but rather to be a complementary asset so that we can build capacity and reduce the inequities through mutually beneficial partnerships and collective impact strategies. So with the closure of schools, libraries, after school programs, as well as the cancellation of summer programs due to COVID, calls were being directed and aimed at our organization to do more. And we started to hear those calls quickly echoed across Southwest Ohio. And so we started to explore virtual book clubs and digital communication platforms, as well as how could we incorporate literacy and literature access into our other initiatives that previously did not have a literacy component. So I'll provide just some examples of things that we've done since COVID-19 has come upon us, as well as some things that we're looking to do here in the immediate future. So as Alistair mentioned, related to virtual book clubs, that's something that we've done, and we put out a COVID-19 book challenge. We started shipping out books all across, particularly across our region, but also across the state and nationwide for people to participate. And we created intentional feedback loops for parents, as well as students in the program participating to stay engaged. We also launched a library of a few hundred books of culturally relevant and responsive texts, and a women's shelter also featuring women in STEAM and girls and women's empowerment. And we also are currently in the process right now of establishing anti-racist literacy initiative and coalition in our community between our urban city as well as the surrounding rural counties. So we're also looking at, what are the intersections of COVID-19 as well as the reemergence of Black Lives Matter. And that book club will be high school students, and will specifically be reading Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kennedy. And then another thing that we're working on right now, we have a pocket park, as we mentioned, with a basketball court on it. We have a youth arts organization that's going to be painting a mural on that at the beginning of August. So again, we were intentional about how do we incorporate a literature component into this program. So that group, we're going to be leading a book club, and we'll be reading The Crossover by Kwame Alexander. So COVID-19 for our organization has really opened up our eyes to new ways of operating and engaging families that otherwise we would not have explored previously. And we have realized that even as a hyper-local and place-based organization, that our impact did not have to be geographically bounded. So as many takeaways that we've learned through this experiential learning journey and process that's been COVID-19, one of the biggest takeaways of all that we've come to know is really the gift of unlearning.
Well, what always strikes me about your work and with Conscious Connect is not only how intentional you are, but how innovative you are, and just hearing how you've just adapted and really thought through, well, how can we meet the community where they are, is really one of the most important steps with regard to book access. So I'm hoping as a panel we can bring together our collective passion and our collective brain power. Let me just throw out a question to all of you. What other topics and issues do we need to be aware of and think through with regard to book access during these really challenging times? Susan, what are your thoughts in response to that?
I'd like to answer that to begin with, because one of the things I want people to take away with when we talk about these things is it's not just about books. I mean, books are not a tchotchke. This is a word that means that what we need to see is a connect between people and books. It's not enough to produce and have books just go to communities. In other words, if someone gives me a book and it's a book that I don't care anything about, it just becomes an object. It's not something that I'm going to really care about. So one of the things, and it will be a theme that I want to talk about a little bit more, Molly, as we go along, is that what we're looking for is really to understand our children in these communities and address their interests through books. In other words, literacy has to have a purpose, has to have a reason. We just don't read for the heck of it. We read to know about something. And I think that what we haven't done adequately is really tapped what drives those children? What is interesting to them? What do they want to learn more about? And because literacy is not a mechanical process. It is a love affair that children come to have with an idea or a topic or something that drives them.
And when I think about book access, I think about not only flooding these areas with a quantity of books and the quality of books, but really also how are we going to be purposefully and intentionally and organically promoting literacy and reading as a culture within the community. Alistair, what are your thoughts?
Yes, so, connecting to what Dr. Neiman just said, I think that I'm thinking of some of the work that Dr. Neiman and I have actually been able to, I've had the privilege of working with her on, one of Libraries Without Borders programs has been to support public libraries to extend public library services to coin laundromat waiting areas. And if you don't live in the US, we have a very unique way of washing our clothes in certain parts of the country that, as I've traveled, I realize is particularly American. But in these spaces, we've been able to meet families where they are. And what we've learned is that it's not just about, as Susan said, providing any books, right, and dropping them there. A lot of it is around the kinds of books you curate and then the programs that you facilitate around those books. The relationships that you build around those books make a big difference. And I think that that is a big part of what we need to be thinking about during the pandemic. How does that change the kinds of books that ought to be curated? How does that change? How does the pandemic change the kinds of programs that you actually facilitate around the books?
And the work around civic studies, what I love about it is you've really tapped into an audience that is sort of, they're almost captive when you look at the literacy initiatives in laundromats. You're there for a couple of hours. Most people return to the same laundromat time and time again. You are trying to, sort your whites and darks while you're trying to tell your child to behave and such. And so the literacy rich activities, that work I just think is so compelling and so well thought about in terms of that intentionality that Carlos was speaking about. Carlos, any other thoughts to add with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that the panel is talking, really at the heart of, what Rudine Sims Bishop positioned as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, which is, number 4 of ILA's Children's Right to Read. I think so many times when we're talking about working with diverse students and diverse families, and we talk about culturally relevant and culturally responsive text, that immediately we go to, very, very hyper serious text about, the plight of the Black community and just what that historical legacy has meant. So I think especially, just in general, but especially right now, just given everything that's going on around the world in terms of Black Lives Matter, we really have to be conscious as educators about what text we're exposing, especially our underrepresented, underserved populations to, knowing that they're already being inundated with a ton of information related to the racial realities, and they might not be at an age in which they're able to fully process that information in a manner that would be in line with best practices for trauma-informed care. So I wanted to mention that related to the culturally responsive and relevant text, but also, here we're talking mainly about ILA's Children's Right to Read, the second objective related to access to text, primarily in the print format, but digital is also, I think, intentionally included in that as well. So what we've seen, I think, both in urban as well as rural contexts as well, is that with the closure of schools, even when students are really in school, is that not everybody has the same access to digital, to Wi-Fi, and just being able to continuously educate and access and engage in modes of learning is also very, very critical. So I think also talking about the digital divide and digital inclusion is equally as important.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, actually, because you're spot on in that there is that component of print and digital. And when we talk about book access, we naturally go to the print format, but now more than ever, we are leading lives and leading literacy lives that are so digitally based. So let me redirect to the entire panel. Thoughts about the digital versus print and the inequity or the divide or the challenges or the opportunities that you're seeing with regard to access because of the pandemic. Alistair, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think that one of the things that is top of mind for me right now is, as COVID-19 has catalyzed many literacy programs to move digital, I actually think it creates opportunities to develop local digital e-publishing industries. And I'm thinking about this in the international context, where I think there's currently a lack of content in local languages. There's a lack of diversity of publications. In West Africa, where Libraries Without Borders does a lot of work, for example, many children do not speak French when they arrive at school and are expected to learn to read in French, in part because the textbooks are published by French companies, right? And one thing we're trying to think through now is how the pandemic may actually allow us, give us the opportunity to work with local partners to develop e-publishing industries with more open access models that, the challenge is to find ways to actually pay those authors, right? And how can we leverage the challenges and opportunities raised by the pandemic to, by doing so, increase the relevance, the dynamism, the financial sustainability of providing reading materials?
I'd love to respond to Molly, because I do a fair amount of work on learning vocabulary through educational media. And it's very clear to me that children can learn through wonderful educational media that we're lucky to have, like PEEP and Sesame Workshop and all these wonderful resources. But I want to accentuate the fact that there's something special about a book, a physical book that parents and children can read together. What we find is that when children are using digital text, they tend to do that on their own. And it's an independent resource for children to learn incidental words. It's great. But there's no such thing really as co-viewing when we talk about media. It's a personal experience. And so I go back to the actual printed book and I say that one of the things we know is that book language matters, but also the extra textual talk that the adult or the caregiver or whoever is using when that child is being read to, or when that parent is sitting close to that child and touching that child in a tender and loving way. What they are doing is they are bonding and telling us right away that that book really, really matters. So I would say yay to digital, but give me the old-fashioned traditional print book.
Well, I want to be mindful that we are having this conversation in mid-July, which is a time of a lot of anxiety as many of our audience is figuring out what the returns for school are in a few weeks or in a month or so. So I know one of the questions that is forefront in many people's minds is how we as a community, and I assume the community that we are made up of tonight are teachers and librarians and school leaders and parents. What can we do to support book access in communities? How can we meet families where they are, and how can we meet the needs of families during these challenging times with regard to book access?
Yeah, I think just being creative and just thinking about different modes of delivery that you've never thought of before. So we have about over 110 literary access points, from barbershops to beauty salons to little libraries to a mobile book bike. And those were predominantly really passive experiences that we created so people could have neighborhood access. But once COVID hit and we created the COVID-19 book challenges, I found myself driving to neighborhoods that I had never drove to in my county and in my region before to hand deliver books to children and to families. Just really in terms of just going the extra mile. Also, obviously, we're all dealing with a lot of being mindful of capacity. It would have been really, really easy for us just to say everything is going digital, but just the need and the demand to make sure that we can still provide that quality content through text, I think is really, really important. And just to keep that constant human interaction, that really just a culture, right, of not only access, but how do we create a culture of readers within our community. And for us, it's also been critical when you have schools being closed. With schools being closed, some parents are still going to work, and particularly in our community, right? A lot of grandparents are having to step up into those roles, right? So I think it's also important that we talk about multi-generational coalition building within the literacy movement as well, right? So how are we making these platforms, particularly in COVID-19, if you are delivering something through a digital medium, to make sure that it's accessible to older populations as well. So I think that's also a part of the conversation, is making sure that we're approaching this work in an intentional manner that's multi-generational.
Alistair, what are your thoughts on meeting families where they need, getting them resources they need at these challenging times?
I think it's the critical part that I'm reading through the questions now. in the chat, and the discussion I think is interesting around whether a book is a book is a book or not, right? And you know, again, I think it varies by context, right? I think that the absolute importance of having literate-rich environments is one part of the puzzle. And another part of it is, and particularly for people without a safety net, right? I think the difficulties of working 3 jobs that might right now not be safe to work in, right? And having your children not be in school and needing to take care of them somehow pushes anything that's not an immediate need to the back burner, right? And I think especially for families that face such challenges, which I think the number is increasing, right, as the pandemic continues, we as librarians, teachers, right, folks who are advocating for and promoting literacy, I think it's critical that we think through how we support those families, right? And it may not be directly through the things that we've done in the past, and it may require us to change the ways in which we think about meeting these families where they are, not just in location, right, but also in terms of the way in which we frame the importance of books and the importance of literacy.
Well, thank you, Alistair, for scanning some of those questions which are coming in. Thank you to those of you who are submitting and continuing to submit. So let's turn to some of those questions from the audience. One of the questions that I'm seeing come up several times is for the teachers out there and the librarians who have put a lot of time and effort, and obviously probably some of their own money into building rich classroom libraries that meet the needs of their students. How do we still allow book circulation to continue, knowing the restrictions that we are facing with the pandemic? What might that look like? And I know that, Carlos, this is some of the work that you guys are grappling with on a daily basis. How do we go about doing that, getting classroom libraries into the hands of kids when and if schools return in a face-to-face format come late summer or fall?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I certainly won't pretend to be a public health expert here. To be completely honest, I think sometimes as professionals, the best thing that we can do is to admit that we don't have all the answers, and to get in community, such as this conversation and dialogue here, to see what other people are doing in other districts, right? I know that there are a ton of different various health guidelines that certain districts are coming up with. I would say as libraries and teachers, the first thing that I would probably be looking at is public libraries, because the public libraries are opening up much sooner than most of the school districts, and seeing what protocols and challenges they are having in terms of opening up and in terms of giving people access to the different, both text as well as digital resources. But that's such a tough question. I wish I had the answer. The answer for us really has just been, whether you're talking about, utilizing First Book Marketplace. Originally, we used to ship all of the books directly to ourselves, and we would distribute them at one of our access points or, at various programs. It's been a little bit of an extra work on us, but we've started to ship them directly to the homes of those students, just to minimize the person-to-person contact and touching those different books. But I think, unfortunately, this is going to be an ongoing learning experience, and I don't think that there's any one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, please, Alistair.
So the International Federation of Library Associations has a page specifically dedicated to COVID-19 that I have found very useful in my work, and they update it pretty regularly. And there's a whole section on the research being done around the scientific research that they summarize for non-scientists to understand around how the virus may survive on paper versus on wood, and an overview of how different library systems around the world have been trying to make sure that they can continue to share books safely. I think the most common is that the books get collected and quarantined for 72 hours before they get added back into the stacks. And I'm happy to share that in the chat box.
Thank you for that resource. Another question, which is coming up several times, for the teachers out there who potentially are only meeting with their students virtually. Certainly some major urban areas have announced in advance that they're starting the school year in a digital capacity. How does a teacher in that situation, how do we get books to kids both now and then potentially over ongoing weeks without the opportunity to see kids face to face?
Well, we've been reading to children, and we put it on YouTube, and we've gotten very fancy about it, actually, putting music and dance along with our book reading. So we say that children need books all the time. It may not be a physical situation. We may not be able to do that, but we can continue to read as teachers to these children and really show them the wonderful books that we love and share them in the best way possible. So I think we have to be creative in this situation. It's not like we've ever had before, but these children will need to hear books about books all the time. And so we have to come up with interesting strategies to make that happen.
Another question that I'm seeing, and we're getting lots of individual questions about certain populations or certain needs. People are asking about availability of audio text when we often talk about digital text, but resources for audio text. Does anybody have any thoughts to add on that as another way to increase access?
Yeah, audio text. I think, you know, a lot of this in terms of delivery and accessibility, as well as what's engaging to specific populations. Something that we haven't talked about specifically within the framework of student populations is age demographics, right? So I think if you're talking about teenage populations, obviously, you know, they're engaged heavily in social media or TikTok, which is kind of an audio social media platform in and of itself. You have a lot of different teenagers that are engaged as YouTubers, as well as podcasting as well. So I feel like nothing is going to replace. I agree with Susan. You know, I'm pretty much a fanatic for you know, hard copy text, as you can see behind me. But I think that there are ways to supplement the hard text materials with audiobooks and other digital platforms, as well as even videos as well. So I mean, I think if you're a teacher that's, you know, examining, you know, if you're being forced to do, you know, in class or completely online or even a hybrid models, right? How do you keep people engaged for a quarter or an entire semester when you're not able to have that face-to-face interaction, right? So how can you be talking about, you know, a digital book, but also find an audio book or a TED Talk, something that's still related and delivering in a multitude of different ways so we can reach all of our learners at the different positions that they might be more receptive to receiving the information, particularly during this time period.
Yeah, I'd like to also make a shout out for Audible, because when children hear a story, they're actually getting some really important decontextualized language. They're having to imagine it without the benefit of a picture, without the benefit of a page. And it can be enormously helpful because you pay attention to the language more when you're actually listening to a story. So that's a wonderful strategy to bring books to children in a different mode entirely.
And when we think about literacy, so often when we define literacy, we go to reading and writing, and we sort of overlook the speaking and listening components, and that audible and audiobooks access that way really builds that, that listening component. Another question which continues to come up is how to engage parents, how we as teachers and we as literacy advocates know the importance of books, know the importance of reading to children. How do we engage parents during this time when they are overwhelmed by their household dynamics, by their personal challenges, by navigating these unforeseen times? How can we get parents on board with us and build them as partners in the issue around access?
We've done a fair amount of work with parents and in different communities throughout the country. And one of the things that we've learned is that parents will read if there's a reason to read. If they see it as useful in helping their children, in helping their children's lives. So one of the things, and was brought up before, and Carlos and both Alistair brought this up, but parents often want to share their culture with children. And having culturally sensitive books is so critically important because parents actually want to read them to the child, to convey their culture, to talk about their history, to share who they are with their children. And I think that one of the things that we often forget is we focus on good books, books that are so-called classics, or, books that are great. But sometimes the book that really matters and that parent wants to read to their children are not necessarily good books. They're books that matter to that parent and are important for the parent to share with their child. So I think we have to think differently about book selection. So for example, one time in our project, the parent was asked to select what books they would want to read to their child. And they picked a book, believe it or not, by a small biography of Barack Obama. And the parent said, if he can do it, my kid can do it. And what she wanted to share is the history and the life of Barack Obama, because that conveyed an important message to her child. And so I think that we need to think about the cultural relevance of our books and what matters to families, and stop thinking about what is good, but what is meaningful to that parent.
Alistair, do you care to add on to some of these conversations about engaging parents? I know you can certainly, you're seeing a global perspective, so you may be seeing some very different and interesting approaches.
I'm thinking, please don't ask me, this is so challenging. No, it's a big part of it is, at least with the families, the broad diversity of families that I get the opportunity to engage with, is what resources your family has and that your community has, right? And I think this is where, in some ways, we're seeing that. Also, what I'm seeing is that somewhat more collectivist cultures with families where they share responsibilities are able to deal with the pandemic in ways that more individualistic societies, I think of myself living in the US included, are struggling with more, to be able to deal with the fact that schools are closed, right? And have people working and still being able to have someone in the family be able to create literate environments and, read with the kids during the day. And I think that, it's not that there's one way that's better or worse, or, it's not a cultural judgment. I think what I'm trying to point out is that it's not just about the wealth of the family, but also about the social resources that a family has. And a lot of that shapes the ways in which we ought to be thinking about how to get parents engaged. In the US, with the families that I get to work with, again, thinking about the just daily challenges of paying rent and getting food on the table alone are top of mind in ways that, I think are get into real social justice issues, in which I think book access is a part of, and I would even include, access to this kind of learning opportunity, which is, as the pandemic has worsened, becoming more and more unequal.
And actually, I want to use that as an opportunity to pick up on a theme which is coming across in several different questions. We started our conversation tonight looking at the ILA, children's right to read, and we've discussed a bit about how print and digital are under the Declaration of a Children's Right to Read. Should the children's rights to read include more of a focus on digital access? How can we go about that, knowing that this is not necessarily a short-term situation that we are currently living in? How do we go about bringing in the access to digital life and digital literacy during these times?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and something for the entire group to consider, as well as the association, right? I mean, is digital literacy and access to digital text such a critical issue here in the 21st century that it should potentially be its own right in and of itself, and not necessarily coupled in with print text. I work at a university for a living, working with entrepreneurs and business owners, and just general, but also in the tech space. We're also talking about digital literacy as a 21st century workforce skill, and not something that's really a separator or a differentiator in the workplace, but really for many of the children and students that we're engaging with right now is pretty much going to be a prerequisite. So I absolutely think that we have to continue to make more strides and more gains in terms of digital literacy and digital inclusion. And some of that is us being comfortable with failure as teachers, as educators, which we're not so comfortable with, just given how the K-12 system is traditionally and historically structured and how we're designed. But many times, depending on what grade level we're working with, our students are more tech savvy than we are. So as educators, we don't want to engage in tech instruction for the fear that our students are ahead of us. So I think that, man, that's a really great question, and something for us to continue to consider is how are we approaching digital literacy really as a topic to be addressed in and of itself.
Alistair, what are your thoughts?
What I see in not just formal education, but informal and non-formal sectors as well, is too often people think of both literacy and digital literacy as short-term investments that can easily be taught in a few, especially digital literacy, in 3 or 4 workshops, right? And I think that the problem with that is that it often frames the skill as a technical skill rather than as a more holistic process that actually requires some critical thinking, right? I think, it's been, as we've seen, as disinformation and misinformation is spread online, that those two spaces of digital literacy and literacy are absolutely intertwined and perhaps connected by a broader information literacy, where folks are able to distinguish between what is a primary source and a secondary source, how to sort through what information is relevant or reliable in their particular context. And to me, that's not something that is easily taught in 3 hours, right? It's something that requires long-term investment. And I would hope, and this gets into the equity issue again, that given the moment that we're in, especially in the US, that we can think more about how we move our community investments, right? The ways that we think about keeping our communities safe, and how we think about employment in the future, to invest in longer term pieces. And I don't think it's just a political question. I think of it as, a part of a shift in the ways that programs are funded, right? Where short-term quantifiable outcomes are prioritized in ways that might continue to make longer-term investments like this either invisible or difficult to prove quickly enough to invest in.
Well, as we, I want to make sure to get to this final question, because I think sometimes when we deal with these large issues of access and equity, it can feel very daunting and very overwhelming. And I want to be mindful that our audience is looking for oftentimes a concrete action step. So we know that we're living through really difficult times, but history has shown us that from great struggle often comes great progress. So I'm going to ask each panelist to share out a concrete action step that you would like our audience of teachers and school librarians and literacy advocates in general, one piece of concrete advice to help us navigate life post-pandemic. Let me start with you, Carlos.
My advice is going to be, more about mindset. I think a lot of this is more so about mindset than any one particular answer to any programming, events, or delivery methods. So my advice is just to be courageous, be innovative, don't be afraid to fail, and to explore the development and delivery of culturally relevant and responsive tools that are both digital as well as text-based, and just use this as an opportunity to explore and create, potentially, specifically if you're in a district that's pretty restrictive to creative autonomy in the classroom. Utilize this see this as an opportunity.
Thank you for that reminder. Sometimes our current situations feel more like a struggle than an opportunity. So it's nice to have that reminder. Susan, what are your thoughts? Concrete takeaway or concrete action step?
Well, probably this is going to be controversial and people will disagree with me, but hey, a panel is all about agreement and disagreement. And so when I think of children coming back to the school, and of course all of us just so yearn to see those beautiful little faces, I think about the fact that they are going to want to talk. They're going to want to talk about some of these crises that we've had, not just about the pandemic, but about Black Lives Matter and some of the things that even very young children are very well aware and need to talk. And one of the things that I would like to argue for is that we need to engage them in this talk, but also use books as an opportunity to do this. Now, one of the things that has troubled me is that we focus too much on leveled text in our classrooms. And there's an emphasis on, do we have the right level for the right child at the right moment? And what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell teachers today to stop thinking about leveling. Think about the child, what that child is really interested in. What do they want to know about? What do they want to learn about through these experiences? And bring wonderful books to the fore and let them use books to understand and to figure out what's going on in their world.
Thank you. Alistair.
When I think about the post-COVID world, I think about the structural changes that will happen for many communities and countries, right? And I think it's safe to predict that unemployment, poverty, these broad sweeping issues will be difficult for many, many communities. And I think that it is in thinking about how communities then pool limited resources to deal with those that it's important to get involved in the conversation. My call to action would be get political, right? I mean, think through how, we know from the last recession that public libraries had in the US, and I'm speaking about this just in the US context, many of them had their budgets halved just as usage went double, right? And, you know, to me, that is a very inefficient way to go back to or, you know, rebuild or move forward in a post economic disaster, post pandemic context. So if you're in the US, I would really encourage you to think through how and look into the ways in which your local library may already have measures in place to have their budgets cut. And most libraries in the US are locally funded. And just as their resources may be needed most as, you know, if things go back to being in person. And one resource I'd look at for that is via the 501c4 called Every Library, which is the only lobbying group for libraries in the US. And there are very, very few of them in international contexts. But, you know, thinking through how to advocate politically for book access in your communities.
Well, thank you for all of those collective thoughts. As we wrap up tonight, I want to just reiterate my appreciation to both the ILA and to our panelists tonight. Your work is inspirational. You've given us so much to think about in the work around book access and ensuring that all children, regardless of where they live, especially in today's pandemic, have access to books. I know that there have been many requests for some of the resources and some of the research that we have we've mentioned tonight. So I do want to give the heads up that we are eager to share out some of these resources. The ILA has compiled them for guests to take a look at. We also encourage you to continue the conversation using the social media handles and Book Deserts and to keep that conversation going. We started our conversation tonight looking at the ILA, Children's Right to Read, and so many of our panelists and guests tonight brought that up. So we encourage you to revisit the Children's Right to Read and really think through that, how that Children's Right to Read impacts your students, your community, and how we may be doing this work at such an important time to ensure that children's right to read. Thank you again to the ILA for putting this panel together. There are more events like this. I know I'm very much looking forward to the next conversation about early reading difficulties. So please be sure to sign up for that one. To our entire audience, everybody out there all across the world, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the work that you are doing to ensure that all children have access to books. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your participation. Good night and stay safe.